Noam Chomsky has made 2 international reputations in unrelated or apparently unrelated fields. The widest is as one of the national leaders of American resistance to the Vietnam War. The deepest is as a professor of linguistics who, before he was 40 years old, had transformed the nature of his subject. He's something of a joker in the pack as far as philosophy is concerned. Many professional philosophers would insist quite sincerely that he isn't a philosopher at all, that linguistics is simply a different discipline, albeit a neighbouring one. Well, I'm not going to argue about that. It's little more than a question of definition anyway. The fact is he was trained as a philosopher, his work has enormous implications for philosophy, and in the writings of philosophers today, I should say his name probably occurs as often as that of any living person. The central point, really, is this. If one problem, more than another, has dominated much of 20th century philosophy, it's that of the relationship between language and the world. Wittgenstein, to give no more than a single instance, was enthralled to this problem throughout his life. Well, now along comes the linguist Chomsky and argues that the way we actually acquire the use of language, and therefore its relationship to experience, and therefore its relationship to the world, are radically different from what the Anglo-Saxon tradition in philosophy has always maintained. He first put his ideas forward in the late 1950s as part of a critique of behavioral psychology. It's not too unfair to say that the behavioral psychologists had tended to talk as if the human individual came into the world as an undifferentiated lump of malleable stuff, which was then moulded and shaped by its environment. Through processes of stimulus and response, they said, penalty and reward, the reinforcement of rewarding responses and the association of ideas, the individual developed and learned, including the learning of language. Now, Chomsky argued that this could not possibly explain how virtually all human beings, regardless of their intelligence, do something as fantastically difficult as master the use of a language, even when they're not deliberately taught it, as most people probably aren't, and they do this at such an extraordinarily young age and in such an extraordinarily short space of time. He argued that for this to happen at all, we must be genetically pre-programmed to do it, and therefore that all human languages must have in common a basic structure that corresponds to this pre-programming. Now, this also has some very important negative implications. The chief of these is that anything that can't be accommodated to this structure, anything, so to speak, that can't be caught in the mesh of this particular network, is linguistically inexpressible and unintelligible to us. So the general principles common to all languages set vital limits to our capacity to understand the world and communicate with each other. Put like that, it sounds like a translation into linguistic terms of some of the basic ideas of Immanuel Kant, and I must say that's always how it's looked to me. But even if so, it's Chomsky who's carried it out, and no one else, and it's proved an enormously stimulating and fruitful thing to do. Professor Chomsky, one of the difficulties about discussing your ideas is that in an obvious sense they're hybrid. In part they're linguistics, in part they're philosophy, and in part they're biology. And in fact you yourself first put them forward in what was really a dispute with biologists, with behavioral psychologists. How did you come to start at that starting point?
Well, the reason was that this picture of the nature of language and the way in which language is acquired was of such enormous prevalence over quite a wide spectrum of thought, including not simply psychology, but philosophy and linguistics as well. The view that was dominant, say at the time when I was a student, say 25, 30 years ago, the dominant picture of language was that it is essentially a system of habits or skills or dispositions to act, and that it is acquired through extensive training, overtraining, through repetition, perhaps through procedures of induction or generalization or association, and that one's knowledge, one's system of the system of habits that one develops simply grows through accretion incrementally as experience is subjected to these processes of generalization and analogy. And in fact, this picture, which plainly is a factual assumption was presented as if it were virtually an a priori truth, which it certainly is not. I mean, it's obviously not necessary that language is a system of that sort, or that it's acquired in anything like that way.
One thing that you pointed out, which is in fact very obvious once it's pointed out, is that most people probably aren't actually taught language at all. That is to say that most parents don't give any systematic instruction of any kind to their children, yet the children nevertheless learn.
Well, I would want to even go beyond that. I think it's certainly the case that language is, in only the most marginal sense, is taught, and the teaching is in no sense essential to the acquisition of language. But in a certain sense, I think we might even go on to say that language isn't even learned, at least if by learning we mean any process that has those characteristics that are generally associated with learning. For example, the characteristics that I mentioned. It seems to me if we want a reasonable metaphor, we should talk about growth. Language seems to me to grow in the mind rather in the way that familiar physical systems of the body grow. We begin our interchange with the world with our mind in a certain genetically determined state, and through an interaction with experience, with an environment, this state changes until it reaches a mature state, which we call a state of knowledge of language. This sequence of changes from the genetically determined initial state to the final state in which we really have a quite complex system of mental computations. This series of changes seems to me very much analogous to growth of organs, and in fact, I think it's not inappropriate to regard the mind as a system of mental organs, the language faculty being one, each of the structure determined by our biological endowment, with interactions also generally determined by the nature of our biological endowment, growing through the triggering effect of experience, which shapes and articulates the organs as they develop in the individual through the relevant period of his life. So, as I say, it seems to me that not only is it wrong to think of language as being taught, but it's at least very misleading to think of it as being learned if we carry with the notion of learning the associations that generally go along with it.
In other words, we are pre-programmed to learn a language in the same way as we're pre-programmed to grow arms and legs and reach puberty in our early teens and all sorts of other, sometimes delayed processes of growth.
Yes, and reaching puberty is a good example, since that's a case of biological development, of ontogenetic development that's plainly pre-programmed in its essence, but takes place after birth. And in fact, we might say that even death, for that matter, is genetically determined. That is, we are biologically constructed so that at a certain time our life processes stop. And in fact, the fact that some development takes place after the organism has begun an independent existence in the world has nothing to say. It tells us nothing about whether it's a genetically determined development or not.
Now, one thing that follows from your view is that if we set out, as you have done in the course of your professional life, to investigate the language faculty of human beings, then what you are investigating is as much a biophysical system, I mean something that actually exists in matter, in stuff, in human tissue, as would be the case if you were investigating human vision or human digestion or the circulation of the blood.
Well, I think that's certainly true. At least we believe it to be true in principle. We are not at a stage now where, in the study of the neural basis for higher cognitive processes, where it's possible to identify the physical structures that are involved in these operations. Correspondingly, the actual study of this organ remains at an abstract level. That is, we can try to investigate the principles by which it functions, but there's very little to say right now about the ways in which these principles are physically realized in structures of the brain.